my name is Anna. I've been living in Cornwall since I was 8. I moved down here with my family. And I've been here ever since. We have lived in our current address for 5 years, which is great. Before that, we had moved annually, which was terrible. We moved for a variety of reasons. It wasn't always because we were being moved on, but we were being moved on for some time. Sometimes we were looking to suitably house our family, which is really challenging to find. The challenge was in finding a property, affording the rent, affording the accompanying bills that go with the rent, because if you rent a bigger property, then of course your bills are all higher. So your council tax in particular is a lot higher. The energy bills are generally higher. And if you move out of town and you're based in town, while the rent might be a little bit cheaper, you have to consider fuel costs or the cost of public transport. And all of these things aren't minor considerations, because when you're on a fixed income, which I am, then everything makes a difference. So yeah, that's where we are now. I'm very, very happy that we've been in a nice spot on a nice street with wonderful neighbours for 5 years. But that is with the ever-present awareness that we could be served with a non-fault eviction notice, or the rent could go up, or any of the things that anything really. There's little comfort in knowing that you've been somewhere a long time, because you know that you don't necessarily have control when that time comes to an end. We've had rodent infestations. We've had walls, internal walls that have been crumbling through damp. We have a kitchen that is, I think most people would consider not fit for purpose. And I think this is an interesting point, because it's fit for my purpose, right? Because I live with it and I use it and I cook in it. Most people, or at least people with choices, would not find it acceptable. If somebody came and looked in my house with a view to living in it themselves, they would rip out the kitchen. And they'd probably change the bathroom as well, which leaked into the kitchen. So actually the kitchen's got a ceiling that is got a hole in it. But I think that's one of the sort of difficult things, is that you become incredibly tolerant of things that other people might find intolerable, and that's fine. It's fair enough. But there's little to nothing that I can actually do about it. And because I don't own any assets, I'm a renter. I have no capacity to borrow against my asset. So if something in my house is not working for me or my family, I've got no authority. If I ask, then if I say, look at this kitchen, it's falling apart. Well, what's going to happen then? Because it's going to cost, and then is that cost going to be passed on to me? And then ultimately, if that cost is passed on to me, that's money I don't have to provide for my family. So I put up with it. Obviously, if something's going to cause long-term damage, I don't want to then impact my deposit when time comes to leave. So I make sure I report. But then that leads you into the foggy maze of people with job titles to do things that don't get done. Yeah. So it's uncomfortable. It's really uncomfortable. Well, there aren't any options. Well, why do you stay? Why don't you leave? Okay. Well, I'm in a fortunate position whereby the rent is less than £1,000. So aren't I lucky? And it's in a beautiful place where we are supported, you know, as a family. We've been there 5 years, and we've made great connections on the street. And I don't want to leave that. I don't want to leave that. It's important. Part of living in a community and living as a family is that you have connections with the people around you. So actually, the choice to leave isn't one I want to take. And also, you know, that's before I even can look around. And I know very well, I've always known actually, because the house next door to us was rented, and it was rented at a higher rate when we moved in. It was, you know, it was over £1,000 5 years ago. So, you know, if the decision was taken to make our house more habitable, then presumably I would incur the cost of having a habitable home, which would take the proportion of money that I spend on rent up 100, 200, £300. That would take it to market value. That's what they're entitled to do. But that's money out of my budget, and that is money away from my kids, and that is money that goes to the letting agent and the landlord, and that makes me really angry. Actually, it's so I choose not to think about it. I choose to suck it up, I suppose, is what you do. But it has quite a profound impact, because being stuck in that position where you have to hold your tongue, particularly with the housing climate as it is right now. I know other people who rent, who are just not mentioning the stuff that's going wrong with the house. You just don't mention it. You don't complain, because there is nowhere to go. You know, an average rent will be, as I said, £200 or £300 at least more than what I'm paying now. I can't afford that. I'm on a fixed income. Falmouth is my home, and it has been since I was a child. It's my children's home. That's where they're at school. So, on the one hand, I have to, if I take the decision to move, I have to accept that I am then uprooting my children, moving them to somewhere where they don't know anyone else, because we don't know, we don't have other places. We're a family, and that's okay. You know, why would I? I don't want to have to start a life again somewhere else, but that's not my choice. Ultimately, that's out of my hands, and that's a horrible feeling. It's really hard, because and there have been times when it all completely spills over, because when you do get a Section 21 notice through the door, all of a sudden you've got to find somewhere else. There was one property that we lived in where I thought it was going to be a long-term thing, and that was super. But I was told as I was going through the process that the landlord was making a decision about whether to rent it to a family or whether to rent it to students. And obviously there's an income, that's none of my business. But, you know, as a family, we paid $750 for an ex-council house, and this was 5 or 6 years ago. Eventually, I think, you know, the decision got too difficult for the landlord, and they decided to sell it. Then we had to, then of course, if the landlord's selling, and we were in that position twice, and it's hideous, because I'm tentative about even calling it home, the place where you're living right then, and it was very difficult at the time, because we were moving annually. Not because that was an anniversary to celebrate. It was just the way it was. When it came up, when the contract came up, you know, you just have to reassess everything, or you get a Section 21 because the landlord's made a decision that isn't in your favour. Yeah, but so when a landlord decides to sell your property, then people want to go and have a look around. The people who go and have a look around aren't generally looking for somewhere to live. They're looking for somewhere to make an income from. So we had people coming round, and I remember asking one woman, "What are you going to do with it then? If you choose to buy this property, what are you going to do with it?" And her words were, "We'll probably let it out to working people or students because it's easier." And it's not a world I'm familiar with, because my struggle is for a roof over my head and to be able to provide a roof for my children. I mean, long term, wouldn't it be lovely to have a home that your children can return to, having successfully navigated education and the job, the job market? They'd be able to come home for holidays or to stay or whatever. But that's never going to happen. That is a rare opportunity for someone who's stuck in a rented situation, because the agencies, they know your financial situation. It's of importance to them, and they know that as your children get older, you lose income because you can't claim for your children who are then adults. So they're quite well aware that at what point you're going to leave, and they can then increase their 10% and they can get more money out of the house. And it's an inevitability of impermanence. And it's hard to see anything other than I struggle to describe those bunker bins as anything other than destitute, really. What a morally destitute decision to import a load of porter cabins, which it was shameful when schools were still using those porter cabins to teach in the 90s. It was like, oh, we've been using these things for too long. These are temporary, they're leaking, they're not insulated, blah, blah, blah. And now we're meant to see it as a heroic answer to homelessness, when in fact, what I've witnessed over the last couple of years is the most appalling feeding frenzy on the housing stock in this place, which is inevitably leading to the destitution of people who call this place home. And it's heartbreaking, and it is difficult to live with, and it is difficult to bring up your kids with a sense of hope and optimism when ultimately you know that it's beyond your capabilities to provide stable accommodation for them going forward. What sort of choice is that? I remember quite a long time ago, so when the university opened, and this is not a point of fault, when the university opened or was going to be opening, an awful lot of people came down here. And as I talk about other people coming down here, I'm going to acknowledge the fact that I came down here with my family, right? So my dad got a job down here because he wanted us to live a better life. We'd been moving around, and he wanted us to grow up somewhere nice. So there have been waves of people coming down here, managerial. Mostly of waves of people in managerial occupations coming down to live a nice life because they don't want to live a city life. And that's a fine decision. And it's one that we all might make if we're in that situation. So there's no fault there, there's no blame there. But when the university came down here, there was a very, very noticeable increase in not the value, the cost of properties in Falmouth. So the terraces, Wellington, Windsor, Marlborough, all the terraces, all of a sudden, the prices went from 70 to 90,000 pounds rapidly, really rapidly, because it was well known and well documented that the average income down here, and it's an average, so lesser or higher, but the average was about £19,000. It was conceivable that one might be able to buy a property when the cost was £30,000 or £40,000, but no longer. But what that enabled people who were wanting to move down and have a nicer life to do was to buy 2 properties with a view to having a sustainable passive income that would sustain their lifestyle, the life that they wanted to leave, and also the future for their children. So there's no blame in those intentions, because they're good intentions. Everybody wants to do the best for their children. But the problem lies in the capability to actually, I don't know, preserve an income into old age, to be able to be able to, I don't know, there's no acceptance that people need somewhere to live. It is a profitable occupation, and it's wrong, that thinking. I mean, we're a nation of people who praise home ownership, and yet we don't look after people who just need that basic shelter. And when I say basic shelter, I don't mean a house that's falling down. I mean something that your landlord would be prepared to live in, something that, you know, people who were wanting a better lifestyle were prepared to live in. And there is a sort of assumption that when you're renting a property, there's no obligation to make it nice. And I moved my daughter in to she moved out of home into an HMO, and it was a really upsetting experience, because while she was, you know, leaving the nest, she was moving into a really grotty house. The carpets were, you get that really thin carpet. That hadn't been looked at or replaced or cleaned for what looked like years. The walls were all sort of, you know, they looked like it. The whole place looked like it needed a damn good scrub. Everybody who's lived in that house before her has paid a deposit and paid rent. So there's no lack of money going through that property. So why is it acceptable for it to be dirty and grotty? You know, why is it? You can spot these houses, you know, that they've got the porch doors are all rotten at the bottom and nobody's looking after them. The gardens are overgrown, the windows are rotten. And yet somebody is making over £1,000 a month out of that. And that, you lose me at that point, really, because, you know, if somebody comes into my house, I want to make them a nice cup of tea. I don't want to give them a mug that I've been drinking out of and just sort of swill it. You know, I want to give them a nice cup of tea. And there doesn't seem to be that sort of motivation among the sort of people who own many properties and who rinse an awful lot of profit out of them. But I would put money on the fact that they wouldn't live like that. So how is that okay? Their dogs probably live better if they're allowed to have dogs in the properties that they live in, which inevitably they can do what they like. It's really hard to see a solution at the moment. It's really hard to see a solution at the moment because it's moving so rapidly. The change of hands of property is moving so rapidly, and people are. Somebody mentioned the other day about the run up to lockdown and how people started hoarding. And what we saw during lockdown wasn't toilet rolls or benign, amusing things. not that a life without toilet. Well, you can survive. Get a jug, but it saves water too, right? But you consider that if you're on a meter. But you know, people were hoarding houses, and I saw it. You know, people driving around, the whole atmosphere and everything changed during that summer after lockdown. And the government basically, you know, gave carte blanche to people to be able to go and consume property, consume food. So the way I saw it is, you know, you get your stamp duty discount or whatever it was. You get money off your food while you're on your jollies looking for somewhere to live, or not live. Some people were looking for somewhere to live and they've moved down. And I don't know how much the population's increased by. And like I said before, they're fine decisions. But you know, there's so much displacement. It feels very much like we have to live by very different rules. I'm not sure if I'm answering your questions. I feel like I'm sort of going round a bit, but no. I suppose you have to learn to navigate what you've got, and it's a difficult thing to talk about without expressing the anger and, truth be told, resentment that I feel about people who can make choices about how they live their lives that are denied someone. I can't even. I look at my garden. I'd love a nice garden. I'd love to have a nice garden. I'd like to spend time out there and feel relaxed about it. But the battle I have in my head is, well, I can go and buy some nice shrubs to bulk that border out and make it pretty. But that shrub's going to cost me 20 quid. You know? So I'm going to invest my time and energy, which is a positive thing for me if I enjoy it, right? But then to be able to fill in the earth that I've turned over, I have to go and spend as much money as I possibly. You can spend as much as you like on a garden, so I can't think of a reasonable figure, whatever. But that has to come out of my budget. Now, if I'm already spending money on rent, I can't afford to spend money on making it nice. That's not for my benefit. The house is already a lot nicer than it was when I moved in. I had to clean you regularly. If you're moving, you don't move into a fresh slate. You have to go in and clean it, and if you want to decorate it, you have to ask permission, and that all comes out of your own pocket. So you're paying your rent. You're paying to make yourself comfortable, and everybody pays to make themselves comfortable. And I'm not suggesting that you get stuff for free, because life that's not the way it is. But you know, when my friend is painting her garden fence to make it look nice, I'm thinking, oh, what a great yeah, that's a really good idea. And then I'm looking at it and I'm like, well, I could be asked to leave next week. You know, I could be on 6 months' notice to find somewhere else to live. So my motivation is gone then, really. And that's something that's really come over time, and it's a real shame, because it's not a particularly warm attitude, and it builds resentment because I can't make a life of my own design. I separated from my partner, I don't know how long ago it was, but he still lives in the house, and that's fine. It's fine. It's fine for us, but actually he can't leave. There's nowhere to go. Because I'm a parent carer, I have a responsibility for the children, and therefore his child, and that leaves him in a position where he's got no sort of advantage is the wrong word, but it's the only word I can think of that will secure him housing. You know, you have to be sort of forced into destitution before anyone might step in and help. And even then, there's not much chance, actually, that you are going to get any help. So people are living in situations that make them deeply uncomfortable and unhappy and restrict their life opportunities and choices because there is simply nowhere to live. There is no shelter to find. And it's an appalling indictment of how we're living now, that people are subjected to this. And yet, there are an awful lot of people living their best life as a consequence. And that's the rub, because I don't think that there's anyone living their best life who wants to do it to the detriment of other people. Not really. So there's a solution in there, but I don't know what it is. And as someone who's sort of struggling with this situation, the tendency is that people don't want to listen to people like me who are actually in the struggle, because it's hard. People want to listen to Simon Hughes. Is it Simon Hughes? The guy who came down and did the documentary about Cornwall, all of a sudden people were astounded at the poverty that exists here. This is not news. This is not news. You know, I was volunteering for a clothing bank, and simultaneously there was a food bank, and simultaneously the Samaritans are there, because that's how you feel when you're going to pick up clothes for your children because you can't afford to go to the shops. That's how you feel when you're going to a food bank because you've got pretty much no food left in the cupboard. And I remember posing the question to myself, I don't need to go to the food bank. I don't need to go to the food bank. And then I had a word with myself. I was like, Anna, you have got £20 left in your massive overdraft. Going to the food bank is not the worst decision that you will make today. And actually, it was the best decision I made the day because, you know, I presented as I was, which was scared and worried. And there was a woman there on that day who did offer me support, but I had to surrender to accept that support. And that's difficult when, you know, you want to provide shelter and food and clothing for your children. Yeah, rock bottom shouldn't be an inevitability. It should be something that happens to people who fall through the nets of a well-resourced welfare system. And our welfare system is rubbed to shreds. And it is heartbreaking and devastating for so many people. And so many people will never be heard. And people are just falling off. And that lies ahead for people who, it's well known that when you don't have secure shelter, when you don't have easy access to the food that will nourish you, you don't have safety in which you can relax, your attainment is less. Your opportunities are fewer. The way that you see the world is not going to open up for you in a way that it will for people who have opportunities to go on exciting holidays and enrich their lives and enrich their experiences. So, and actually there's another rub, because when you're paying the rent, you're subsidizing somebody else's opportunities. You're subsidizing other people giving their kids a life that you cannot provide for your own children. And that is devastating. That is absolutely devastating. And another thing that's devastating is, is when people say things like, well, you know, they worked hard and saved. They worked hard and saved. You know, they made good decisions. You know, there is so much judgment on people who are in my position that there is shame. And shame shouldn't be available to people who are trying their best. Shame shouldn't be available to people who only want a better life and do the best by the people who are around them. And yet there it is. I don't know, you just have to take every day as it comes. And you just have to get on with it. There's no point. Any future that you plan, I mean, I'm doing stuff at the moment that I need stability for. You know, I'm embarking on new training and things like that. And my kids need stability because they've got GCSEs and exams and all of these things. So it's a lot like that, really. And be nice when the landlord phones you or talks to you, or, you know, the agency around. And that's hard work because, you know, they like to jolly you along and say, well, isn't it nice? And I'm like, yeah, it is. It is. That's true. But what's your long-term, you know? Actually, my landlord's answer to what's his long-term plan is, well, it's not my problem. It'll be passed on to my daughter when I die. And it's all right because she's got a nice place, so I'm just like, oh. And yeah, I'll shuffle around I'll shuffle everything around as long as I can to cover the bases. And in the meantime, you know, one day at a time. And today is beautiful. We have beautiful days, so we keep it there, and it's okay.